The turkey hadn't even been carved yet. That's the detail I keep coming back to. 32 years of Thanksgiving dinners in that house, and my father chose to do it before the meal. Before grace. Before anyone had even unfolded their napkin. He wanted an audience, and he wanted them hungry, alert, attentive, fully present for what he had planned. I noticed the envelope the moment I walked in. It was sitting beside his plate like a place card, crisp and white against the burgundy tablecloth my mother brought out every November. Dad was already at the head of the table when I arrived, jacket still on, which was unusual. He never kept his jacket on at home. That detail alone told me something had shifted. He was performing. He had dressed for a verdict. I kissed my mother on the cheek. She accepted it without warmth, turning her face slightly so my lips landed closer to her ear than her face. I shook Uncle Pete's hand. He pumped it once, hard, with a grin that had too much satisfaction in it for a holiday greeting. My cousin Dara waved from across the table. My Aunt Linda gave me the careful smile of someone who already knows what's coming and has decided to stay out of it. I sat down. I placed my bag beside my chair. I poured myself a glass of water. Dad cleared his throat. "Before we eat," he said, "I want to address something as a family." My mother folded her hands. Uncle Pete leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had been briefed. Dara looked at her plate. Aunt Linda reached for her wine. Dad picked up the envelope. "I had my attorney draw this up this morning," he said. "You will. Executed and witnessed." He set it down on the table and slid it toward the center as though presenting evidence. "Mara is no longer a beneficiary. She's been removed. Completely." He looked directly at me when he said it. Not with anger. That would have been easier. With something closer to relief. Like a man who had finally, after years of deliberation, done what he should have done long ago. Uncle Pete started clapping. Fully. 2-3 times. Like a golf clap at the moment a difficult putt drops. My mother said, "He warned you, Mara. You had every opportunity." "Absolutely," Aunt Linda murmured, though she didn't look at me when she said it. I looked at the envelope in the center of the table. I looked at my father. I looked at Uncle Pete, still smiling with his hands now folded across his stomach like a man settling in for a show. I nodded once. "Understood," I said. That was all. No raised voice. No tears. No demand for an explanation, though I could have listed 17 things I'd done in the past decade that warranted one. I simply nodded, picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. "What happened next I will tell you. But first you need to understand how we got here, and more importantly, you need to understand who I actually am because my family certainly didn't. My name is Mara Calloway. I am 34 years old. I have a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown, which my father attended the graduation of and then spent the dinner afterward explaining why a law degree would have been smarter. I spent 3 years at a federal consulting firm in Washington, D.C. after graduation, which my mother described to relatives as government work. You know how vague those jobs are. In my family's version of me, I was the child who had potential and squandered it. The one who moved to D.C. for a job that no one could fully explain at a dinner party. The one who didn't come home enough, didn't call enough, didn't show appropriate deference to my father's opinion on how my career should progress. My father, Gerald Calloway, built Calloway Construction over 30 years from a 2-truck operation into a regional firm with roughly 60 employees and an annual revenue that fluctuated between $8 and $14 million depending on the year. He was proud of it in the way that men of his generation are proud of physical things: buildings, trucks, contracts, crews. He understood it completely, and that understanding made him feel superior to things he couldn't touch. He could not touch what I did. My mother, Sandra, deferred to my father on every professional matter and had for their entire marriage. If Gerald said my career was vague and unimpressive, then it was vague and unimpressive. She didn't ask follow-up questions. He never had. Uncle Pete was my father's younger brother and his self-appointed hype man, a man who had built nothing of his own but took enormous reflected pride in whatever Gerald accomplished. He had disliked me since I was 16 and corrected him at a family dinner about a factual error regarding a local zoning ordinance. He had never forgotten it. Men like Pete never do. In their version of my life I was coasting. Living in a 1-bedroom apartment in D.C. on a government salary that didn't justify the cost of living. Occasionally sending a card for birthdays. Refusing to come home for events that mattered. Embarrassing the family with my vagueness. Here is what my family did not know. 18 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, I had been promoted to Deputy Director of Federal Infrastructure Procurement at the Office of Contract Administration. A position that does not get announced on LinkedIn, does not get explained at holiday dinners, and carries a level of clearance that I am not at liberty to discuss in detail even now. In plain terms, I managed a portfolio of federal construction and infrastructure contracts worth, at the time of that Thanksgiving, approximately $340 million annually across 14 states. I decided which firms got on the approved vendors list. I decided which firms stayed. I reviewed bids, flagged conflicts of interest, and made recommendations that the department almost universally adopted because I had built, over 6 years, a reputation for being exactly right. Callaway Construction had been on the approved vendors list for federal subcontracting work for 4 years. They had won 2 smaller contracts under my tenure. Both before my promotion, both before I had any direct authority over the list. After my promotion, I had quietly recused myself from any review involving Callaway Construction and flagged the family relationship to my supervisor as a precautionary measure. Everything was documented. Everything was clean. The current contract, a $7.7 million federal infrastructure subcontract for highway maintenance work across 3 counties, had been awarded 8 months prior. My name was nowhere near that approval. I had recused completely, disclosed fully, and removed myself from the chain entirely. But I was still deputy director. And the deputy director, under certain circumstances involving conflict of interest flags or vendor compliance issues, has the authority to initiate a vendor review that can result in removal from the approved list. I had never used that authority on Callaway Construction. I had, until that Thursday, intended never to. My director, Ellen Marsh, knew about my family relationship with the firm. She also knew about the Thanksgiving dinner, because I had told her months earlier that my father had begun making comments about my position being less important than it sounds, and had, on one occasion, implied to a relative that I had used family connections to help his firm get contracts, the precise opposite of what had occurred. Ellen had told me, with the dry precision of a woman who had spent 20 years in federal administration, document everything. And if it ever becomes relevant, you know what to do. I had documented everything. Now it was relevant. The will announcement didn't come from nowhere. It was the final move in a campaign that had been building since the previous spring. It had started with money. Specifically with my father's assumption that my proximity to federal contracts meant I was in a position to informally, his word was help, steer work toward Callaway Construction. He had raised it first in April over the phone, framed as a question about how the bidding process worked. I had explained carefully that I was fully recused from anything involving his firm, that this was documented, and that any attempt to influence procurement outside the formal process was a federal matter, not a family favor. He had not liked that answer. In May he called again. This time he didn't frame it as a question. He suggested that given everything he had done for me over the years, the college tuition, the first and last month deposit on my first apartment, the graduation trip to Europe, it was reasonable to expect that I would find a way to be useful to the family business. I reminded him again that I was legally prohibited from what he was describing. He told me I was being dramatic. In July, Uncle Pete visited D.C. ostensibly for a conference. He took me to dinner at a restaurant my father had clearly selected and paid for in advance, and spent the meal explaining that Gerald was disappointed in me, that the family had always supported me, and that surely there was something, a phone call, an introduction, a word in the right ear, that I could offer. I told Uncle Pete exactly what I had told my father. I paid for my half of the dinner and took the metro home. In September, my mother called to tell me that my father had decided some things about the will and that I should think carefully about whether I wanted to repair the relationship before the holidays. I asked her directly, repair it how? She said, you know how, Mara. I told her I didn't. She said she hoped I'd come around. I booked my flight home for Thanksgiving. Not because I expected a good dinner. Because I wanted to look my father in the eye when he realized that every assumption he had made about my position, my loyalty, and my silence was wrong. After my father's announcement, after Uncle Pete's applause, after my mother's "he warned you," the table moved forward with dinner in the manner of a family that has just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. My mother began serving. My aunt passed the rolls. Uncle Pete poured wine with the expansive generosity of a man who has just won something. My father cut the turkey with the focused precision of someone who needed an activity to absorb the anticlimactic calm of my response. They had expected tears. Or an argument. Or perhaps a negotiation. Some version of me finally saying, "Fine, I'll make a call." They had not expected me to nod once, say "understood," and reach for the cranberry sauce. I ate. I made appropriate conversation with my cousin Dara, who was studying nursing and had nothing to do with any of this. I asked my aunt about her garden renovation. I listened to Uncle Pete explain at some length a zoning dispute he had opinions about. I did not bring up the will. I did not look at the envelope which my father had moved to the sideboard. At 4:47 p.m., I excused myself to use the restroom. In the bathroom I locked the door. I sat on the edge of the tub. I opened my phone and found the contact for my federal procurement officer, David Reyes, who was not working on Thanksgiving but who had, in our years of working together, become someone I trusted completely. I typed, "David, need you to initiate a vendor compliance review on Callaway Construction first thing Monday. Flag it for conflict of interest family relationship and recent external pressure on procurement staff. I'm formally escalating. I'll send full documentation over the weekend. Pull them from the approved list pending review." I stared at the message for 11 seconds. I pressed send. Then I washed my hands, unlocked the bathroom door and walked back to the dinner table. "Everything okay?" my mother asked. "Fine," I said. "Everything's fine." At 6:23 p.m., while my mother was serving pie, my father's phone buzzed on the table beside his plate. He had left it face up, a habit that had always annoyed my mother and that she had long since stopped correcting. He glanced at it. A voicemail notification. The name on the screen read, "Terrence, accountant." He picked it up, tapped the voicemail icon, intending to raise it to his ear. He hadn't updated his phone's Bluetooth settings since connecting it to the kitchen speaker system during a renovation 3 years prior. The kitchen speaker, 6 feet from the dining room table, was still paired. Terrence Albright's voice filled the room at full volume. "Gerald, it's Terrence. Listen, I need you to call me back tonight if you can. I've been getting alerts from the federal vendor portal. Looks like there's a compliance review flag that just went up on Callaway Construction. It's marked urgent. I don't know where this is coming from, but it's tied to a conflict of interest notation and it names the firm directly. Gerald, if this goes through, you're off the approved list. The Harmon Highway contract, the 7-7, that's at risk. All of it. Call me back. Tonight. Please." The kitchen went silent. My father's hand lowered the phone very slowly to the table. My mother had stopped serving. The pie server was suspended in midair over the dish. Aunt Linda set down her fork. Uncle Pete, who had been mid-sentence about something entirely unrelated, closed his mouth. My father looked at me. Not with the controlled authority he'd worn all afternoon. But something different. Something I had not seen on his face in 34 years. He looked uncertain. "Mara," he said. I picked up my fork. I cut a clean piece of pie. "Gerald," I said. It was the first time in my life I had called him by his first name at a family dinner. The room noticed. Even Dara, who had been trying to stay invisible all afternoon, looked up. "What did you do?" he asked. "I initiated a vendor compliance review," I said. "Through the appropriate channels. Documented conflict of interest. External pressure on procurement staff. It's all in the file. You can't," he stopped. "Recalibrated. That contract is currently under review," I said. "Whether it remains in place depends on the outcome of that review and the compliance findings. I don't control the outcome. I just initiated the process." I paused. "As I am legally required to do when relevant conditions are met." Uncle Pete said, "She can't do this, Gerald. This is retaliation." "It's a federal compliance process," I said, turning to look at him. "Initiated through documented channels, supported by a 6-month record of external pressure on a procurement officer. Which would be me, by a vendor seeking preferential treatment. That's not retaliation, Pete. That's exactly what the process exists for." I looked back at my father. "If the firm is compliant, the review will confirm that. If it isn't, the review will find that. Either way, it has nothing to do with the will." "The will," my father started. "Is your business," I said. I meant it when I said understood. Keep whatever you like. Give it to whoever you want. That's not why I'm here. My mother said quietly, then why are you here? I looked at her. She looked older than she had at the start of dinner. They all did. Because it's Thanksgiving, I said. And because I wanted you to understand something before the review results come in on Monday and your accountant calls you back with specifics. I set my fork down. I have spent 6 years being extremely careful to protect this family from the consequences of its own requests. I recused myself. I documented everything. I flagged the relationship. I did every single thing correctly so that nothing would ever blow back on Dad's firm. I looked at my father directly. And then you spent 6 months pressuring me to undo all of that. In writing. By phone. Through a messenger. I nodded toward Uncle Pete. And I documented all of that too. The kitchen speaker had returned to silence. Terrence Albright's voicemail, having played completely, had simply ended. My father looked at the phone on the table in front of him as though seeing it for the first time. The review, he started again. Runs its course, I said. I have no further involvement. It's out of my hands now. I picked up my fork again. The pie is very good, Mom. You made the crust from scratch. My mother stared at me. She did not answer the question about the crust. I flew back to DC on Friday morning. On Saturday, I sent David Reyes a complete file. Every phone call logged with date and summary, Pete's dinner in July with the restaurant receipt I had kept, 3 text messages from my mother referencing the will in the context of coming around, and a recorded voicemail from my father from August in which he had used the phrase, I'd think about what you owe this family before you decide how helpful to be. I had recorded that call legally in a single-party consent jurisdiction, on the advice of a federal ethics attorney I had quietly consulted in September. David received the file. He called me Sunday evening not to discuss the specifics but to say, this is thorough, Mara. This is exactly right. He paused. You okay? Yes, I said. I'm okay. On Monday morning, the Office of Contract Administration opened a formal vendor compliance review of Callaway Construction. The review covered the firm's active federal subcontract, the $7.7 million Harmon Highway maintenance project, and assessed whether the relationship between a senior procurement official and the vendor's principal had been properly disclosed and managed. It had been. On my side, every disclosure was perfect, every recusal documented, every step clean. The review also, as a matter of standard protocol in conflict of interest cases, examined communications between the vendor and the procurement official for evidence of improper contact. My documentation made that portion straightforward. By Wednesday, the review board had enough. Callaway Construction was removed from the federal approved vendors list pending a full compliance determination. The Harmon Highway contract was suspended and referred to a secondary contracting firm while the review concluded. $7.7 million. Suspended. In 72 hours. Terrence Albright called my father 4 times on Monday. My father called me twice. I did not answer. I had nothing further to say that wasn't already in the documentation. On Tuesday, my father had his attorney draft a letter to the Office of Contract Administration characterizing the review as retaliatory and requesting an immediate reinstatement of the contract. The letter was received, logged, and added to the case file as additional documentation of vendor conduct during an active review. David told me this with the particular flatness of a man trying not to enjoy something too much. The attorney's letter, in other words, made things worse. My mother called on Wednesday evening. I answered. She didn't open with an apology. She opened with, Mara, your father is beside himself. As though that were a report I needed and a problem I was responsible for solving. I imagine he is, I said. The firm, she started. Is under review, I said. That review is entirely independent of me at this point. I initiated it and recused from all further involvement. I genuinely cannot affect its outcome. Can't or won't. Both, I said. And I want to be clear about something, Mom. Not to be unkind, because I don't want to be unkind to you. But the will, the dinner, the things that were said to me over the past 6 months. None of that is separate from this. You asked me to compromise a federal position to benefit the family. When I said no, the consequence was public disinheritance at a holiday dinner. And then you were surprised that I had documentation. Silence. We didn't know, she said finally. We didn't know how serious. You knew enough, I said quietly. You knew I said no. 3 times. Through 3 different people. You knew it was a federal matter. You just assumed that family loyalty would override federal law, and when it didn't, you assumed there would be no consequences. I paused. There are consequences. That's not cruelty. That's just how it works. My mother was quiet for a long time. Is there anything? She started. No, I said. There isn't. Not right now. Let the process finish. I told her I loved her. Because I did. That part, strangely, was uncomplicated. Then I hung up. Uncle Pete did not call. Uncle Pete, I later learned from Dara, had spent Monday and Tuesday insisting to anyone who would listen that I had acted illegally, that there would be federal charges against me, that his brother's attorney was building a case. By Thursday, when no charges materialized and the review findings began to indicate that the documentation trail ran decisively in my favor, Pete's commentary became quieter and then stopped altogether. That is the thing about men like Pete. They are very loud until the moment it costs them something. Then they find somewhere else to be. The compliance review concluded in 3 weeks. The findings were, in the official language of the report, evidence of repeated external pressure on a senior procurement official by an affiliated vendor, inconsistent with federal vendor conduct standards and constituting improper contact during the official's tenure. Callaway Construction was formally removed from the federal-approved vendors list for a period of 36 months. The Harmon Highway contract was permanently reassigned. $7.7 million. Gone. Not because I had taken it. Because my father had spent 6 months trying to take something that wasn't his to take, and I had written it all down. My father's attorney filed one more motion requesting reconsideration. It was denied. Terrence Albright, I was told by a person familiar with the situation, recommended that my father explore a significant restructuring of the business given the revenue impact. 2 of the firm's senior project managers began exploring other opportunities within the first month. My father did not call me again for 11 weeks. When he finally did, it was a Sunday morning in February. I was at my kitchen table with coffee, reading a briefing document. I let it ring once, then picked up. He didn't start with an apology either. That's not who my father is, and I had long since stopped expecting it. He started with, I need to understand what happened. I know, I said. Where do you want to start? We talked for 40 minutes. It was not a warm conversation. It was not a reconciliation in the way movies depict reconciliations, with music and embraced and clean resolution. It was 2 people attempting, carefully, to establish a common set of facts after a long period of operating from entirely different ones. By the end of it, my father understood 3 things that he had not understood before. First, I had not used my position to help his firm. Not once. And the suggestion that I had, which he had made to at least 4 relatives, was factually incorrect and potentially defamatory, and I had quietly had an attorney note that in a letter he would be receiving. Second, I had spent 6 years protecting the firm from its own behavior by maintaining scrupulous documentation and clean recusals. The review had not hurt the firm. The firm's own conduct during the review had hurt the firm. Third, the will was and always had been beside the point. I was not in a position where I needed what was in it. I never had been. And the assumption that threatening it would change my professional conduct revealed how little he had understood about either my position or my character. He was quiet after that third point for a very long time. Then he said, I didn't know what you actually did. No, I said. You didn't. You could have told me. I tried, I said. You told me. It sounded vague. Another silence. The 36 months, he said. Is there any? No, I said. There isn't. That process is completely closed. I'm sorry. He said he understood. I wasn't sure he did entirely. But it was the closest thing to an honest exchange we had managed in years, and I was willing to call it a beginning. The will, as it turns out, was revised again. My father's attorney confirmed this to me in a letter I received the following October. Not because my father called to tell me, but because the attorney was required to notify me as a previously named beneficiary of any material change. I was reinstated. No fanfare. No conversation. Just a legal notification and a brief handwritten note from my father that said, I was wrong about some things. The attorney has the details. I filed the letter. I didn't frame it, didn't share it, didn't post about it. It went into a folder in my filing cabinet between a utility bill and a lease renewal. Callaway Construction survived. It was smaller, leaner without the federal revenue, but my father adapted in the way that people who built something from scratch sometimes can when they are forced to. He took on more private commercial work. He brought in a new operations lead. The business did not thrive the way it had, but it did not collapse. Uncle Pete stopped coming to Thanksgiving. This was presented by my mother as a mutual and amicable decision. I did not ask for details. My mother and I speak on Sunday mornings now mostly about ordinary things. The garden. A show she is watching. Her book club. She does not bring up the review, the will, or the dinner. Neither do I. There is a version of a relationship there, careful and limited, and I have decided that it is enough for now. On the first Thanksgiving after all of this, I stayed in D.C. I had dinner with David Reyes and his family, and with Ellen Marsh and her husband, and with 3 colleagues from the office who had nowhere particular to be. We ate at a long table in Ellen's dining room, and someone brought an exceptional apple pie, and nobody announced anything at the beginning of the meal. It was, I thought, exactly enough. Mara Callaway is a federal procurement official whose full title and agency affiliation are withheld for professional reasons. This account has been reconstructed from her personal records and recollections.